The French and Indian War was not just a distant skirmish in the woods. It was a crucible. It lasted from 1754 to 1763. This conflict was a brutal, defining chapter in our history. It was fought in the dense forests and along the wild rivers of a continent still being shaped. On one side stood the British Empire, vast and powerful. On the other, the French crown, with its own grand designs for North America. But caught in the middle, and fighting for their very survival, were the American colonists. They were not fighting for a king an ocean away. They were fighting for their homes, their land, and their way of life. This war taught them a hard lesson. If you want to keep what is yours, you must be prepared to defend it yourself. This conflict, often overshadowed by the revolution that followed, was in fact its necessary prologue. It was the first time that men from Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New England fought side by side on a grand scale. They were not yet Americans in the sense we understand today. They were British subjects, loyal to the crown. But in the mud and the blood of the frontier, something new was born. They were the ones who understood the terrain. They were the ones who paid the price in spilled blood. The defense of their own land by their own hands planted the seeds of a new identity. An identity rooted not in loyalty to a distant monarch, but in the soil beneath their feet. Before this war, the 13 colonies were a patchwork of separate interests and identities. A farmer in Massachusetts, a planter in South Carolina. They were connected by a shared language and a common king, but not much else. This war changed that. It forced them to cooperate. It forced them to raise militias, to supply armies, and to think about a common defense against a common enemy. The French and their native allies were not just a threat to British imperial policy. They were a direct threat to the lives and property of the colonists on the frontier. The fight was personal. It was about survival. And so, the story of this war is the story of how a collection of disparate colonists began to see themselves as a people with a shared destiny. They learned bitter lessons about the arrogance and incompetence of the British military command. They also learned about their own resilience. The heart of the conflict was a vast and fertile expanse of land known as the Ohio River Valley. This was the prize. Today we think of it as Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia. Back then, it was the untamed West. Dense forests, fur-bearing animals, rivers that served as the highways of the continent. For the British colonies, hemmed in by the Appalachian Mountains, the Ohio Valley represented the future. Expansion, new farms, new opportunities, the freedom of wide-open land. The colonists looked west with hungry eyes, but the French saw something entirely different. Not settlement, a vital link. Canada to the north, settlements along the Mississippi River, Louisiana to the south. Control of the Ohio River meant control of the interior, a French New World built on the fur trade, a network of forts and alliances with native tribes. They wouldn't let Anglo-American farmers plow under this enterprise. The French built a chain of forts to stake their claim. This clash of visions would erupt into violence. It was about more than empires. That spark came in the spring of 1754, and it was carried by a young, ambitious Virginian named George Washington. He was just 22 years old. He was a major in the Virginia militia, not a professional British soldier. Governor Dinwiddie dispatched him into the wilderness with a small force of about 150 men. His mission was clear: tell the French to get out of the Ohio Valley. It was a land claimed by the British Crown, and the presence of French soldiers was an act of aggression. Washington was to deliver a message and assert British authority. It was a diplomatic mission backed by a show of force. But things on the frontier rarely go according to plan. Deep in the Pennsylvania woods, Washington's party encountered a small French diplomatic patrol led by Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The details of what happened next are murky, lost to the fog of war and conflicting accounts. What is certain is that a firefight broke out. Washington's Native American allies. If Fort Necessity was the spark, the British response was an attempt to bring a hammer down on the French. In 1755, London dispatched a full-fledged professional army to North America. It was led by Major General Edward Braddock, a seasoned, stubborn, and deeply arrogant officer of the British establishment. Braddock had contempt for the colonial militias, whom he considered undisciplined rabble, and he had an even lower opinion of the Native American warriors he was told he would need as allies. He believed in the rigid discipline and overwhelming firepower of the British regular army. He was certain that his columns of red-coated soldiers marching in perfect formation would sweep the French from the frontier. His primary target was Fort Duquesne, the very place Washington had failed to reach. Braddock's expedition was a massive undertaking. He assembled a force of over 2,000 men, British regulars, colonial militia, George Washington serving as an aide. They carved a road through the dense wilderness, a monumental feat of engineering that was also painfully slow. The army moved like a giant lumbering serpent, dragging heavy artillery and a long train of supply wagons. The general dismissed warnings from Washington and others about the dangers of ambush. He believed European tactics from Flanders would work just as well in the forests of Pennsylvania. He was disastrously wrong. For 2 years after Braddock's disaster, the war went badly for the British. The French and their native allies launched brutal raids. Settlements were burned. Families were massacred. A tide of terror swept through the backcountry. Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. The British seemed paralyzed, unable to protect their own subjects. London was too focused on the 7 Years' War. The American theater was treated as a sideshow. Morale in the colonies sank. It seemed the French might prevail. The situation looked bleak. The turning point came in 1757, not on a battlefield, but in the halls of power in London. A brilliant and determined statesman, William Pitt the Elder, took charge. Pitt saw North America as central to defeating France, not a sideshow. He pledged to spare no expense to drive the French from the continent. Pitt's energy electrified the effort. He spent vast sums and committed full military and naval might. Pitt's strategy was twofold. First, a naval blockade of France, choking supplies and reinforcements to New France. The French colonies were essentially left to wither on the vine. Second, a new relationship with the colonies. Section 6. The Fall of Quebec, the decisive blow. With William Pitt's strategy in the fall of Quebec, the decisive blow. With William Pitt's strategy in full swing, the British war machine began to roll over the French defenses. The first major prize fell in 1758 with the capture of the fortress of Louisbourg. This formidable French bastion on Cape Breton Island guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, the lifeline of New France. A massive British amphibious force, a testament to the power of the Royal Navy, besieged and captured the fort. Its fall was a devastating blow to the French, opening the gateway to Canada. That same year, another British force finally succeeded where Braddock had failed, capturing Fort Duquesne. They renamed it Fort Pitt, the foundation of the future city of Pittsburgh. The momentum had decisively shifted. The ultimate objective, however, was Quebec. The city was the political, military, and spiritual heart of New France. Perched atop high cliffs overlooking the St. Lawrence River, it was considered nearly impregnable. The task of capturing it fell to a young, ambitious, and moody general named James Wolfe. In the summer of 1759, Wolfe brought a massive fleet and an army of 9,000 regulars up the river and laid siege to the city. For months, he bombarded Quebec and probed its defenses. But the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, refused to be drawn out into an open battle. The British were stymied, and as winter approached, Wolfe grew increasingly desperate. In a stroke of audacious genius, Wolfe devised a daring plan. On the night of September 12, 1759, he had his soldiers secretly row ashore at a small, in a stroke of audacious genius, Wolfe devised a daring plan. On the night of September 12, 1759, he had his soldiers secretly row ashore at a small, poorly guarded cove upstream from the city. From there, they scaled the steep cliffs in the darkness, a feat the French had believed impossible. Section 7. A shifting landscape. The fate of native tribes. Throughout the war, Native American tribes were not passive bystanders. They were active and crucial participants, pursuing their own strategic interests. For decades, tribes like the Iroquois Confederacy had skillfully played the British and French against each other, maintaining a delicate balance of power that preserved their sovereignty and control over their lands. Many tribes, particularly those in the Great Lakes region, St. Lawrence Valley, Algonquin, Huron, Ottawa. This alliance was built on generations of trade, intermarriage, and a shared opposition to the relentless westward expansion of the British agricultural frontier. The French model of forts and trade was far less threatening to their way of life than the British model of farms and fences. The British also had native allies, most notably elements of the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, though the Confederacy itself tried to maintain a precarious neutrality for much of the war. The British promised trade goods and protection from their enemies, and for some tribes, siding with the seemingly more powerful empire was a matter of survival. Native warriors served as scouts, raiders, and essential auxiliary troops for both European armies. They possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain and a style of warfare perfectly suited to the American wilderness, skills that professional European soldiers lacked. Their participation was not a sign of subservience. It was a calculated choice made to protect their people, their land, and their independence. The total British victory in 1763 was a catastrophe for nearly all the native peoples of the eastern half of the continent. With the French gone, the tribes lost their most important trading partner and their crucial strategic counterweight to British power. They could no longer play one empire off the other. Suddenly, they faced a single, overwhelmingly powerful European entity that had a very different view of land and settlement. British traders were often more arrogant and less generous than the French had been. And British settlers, hungry for new land, began pouring over the Appalachian Mountains in defiance of treaties. The balance of power was shattered, and the native tribes found themselves in a dangerously vulnerable position. This new reality led directly to one of the most significant pan-tribal uprisings in American history. Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763, led by an Ottawa chief named Pontiac and inspired by the Lenape prophet Neolin, who called for a rejection of European ways. A loose confederation of tribes rose up against the British. They captured nearly every British fort west of the Appalachians and laid siege to Detroit and Fort Pitt. They were fighting to drive the British out and restore the world that had existed before the war. While the rebellion was eventually suppressed, it terrified the British government. It proved that despite their victory over France, pacifying the continent would be a bloody and expensive business, forcing London to rethink its entire policy for the American frontier. Section 8. The price of victory: debt, taxes, and a growing divide. Victory has a price. William Pitt had achieved victory by writing blank checks. By 1763, the British national debt had nearly doubled to a staggering £133 million. The cost of maintaining a standing army in North America to police the vast new territories, and to protect the frontier from uprisings like Pontiac's Rebellion. Someone had to pay the bill. In London, it seemed reasonable to the King and Parliament that the American colonists should help shoulder the cost. This logic led to a dramatic shift in British policy. For over a century, the colonies had been largely left to govern and tax themselves. Salutary neglect. Now London decided to bring the colonies under more direct control. This new policy began with the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The goal was to appease native tribes and avoid costly frontier wars, but it infuriated colonists and land speculators. Then came the taxes. The Sugar Act of 1764. Sugar and molasses were targeted. The Stamp Act of 1765. Legal documents were taxed. The Townshend Acts followed. Newspapers were taxed. Tea was taxed. To the British, these were modest, reasonable taxes. To the colonists, they were an outrage. The issue was not just the money, it was the principle. For generations, colonists had only been taxed by their own elected local assemblies. They had no elected representatives in the British Parliament across the ocean. This led to the most powerful political slogan of the age: no taxation without representation. colonists argued taxation by a body in which they had no voice violated their rights as Englishmen. They called it a form of tyranny. The war that had secured their safety now seemed to have produced a new threat to their liberty. The colonial response was swift and furious. Protests erupted in Boston. Protests erupted in Charleston. Merchants organized non-importation agreements, boycotting British goods. Groups like the Sons of Liberty used intimidation and sometimes violence to force stamp agents to resign. The colonists, who had learned to cooperate against the French, now began to organize in opposition to Britain. The very measures Britain took to assert authority had the opposite effect. They united the colonies in a common cause. They fostered a growing sense of a shared political identity. And they created a class of leaders experienced in the art of resistance. The war for empire had ended, but a new struggle for liberty was just beginning. Section 9. Conclusion. The birth of an American identity. The French and Indian War was the single most important event in shaping a new American identity. It fundamentally altered the political, economic, psychological landscape of the continent. When the war ended in 1763, France was expelled from North America. Great Britain stood as the undisputed global superpower. Its domain stretched from India to the Mississippi River. But that triumph contained the seeds of its own undoing. Britain created circumstances that led, just over a decade later, to losing its most valuable colonies. The war set the stage for the American Revolution. The colonists emerged with a newfound sense of confidence and capability. They had fought alongside British regulars and were not always impressed. They had seen arrogant generals like Braddock lead men to slaughter. They had seen militia tactics, adapted to the American wilderness, prove effective. They had produced leaders like George Washington, tested under fire. The war forced the 13 disparate colonies to act in concert for the first time. They raised troops and funds for a common cause. This forged connections and a shared purpose. They were no longer just Virginians or New Yorkers. They were becoming something else. The war also changed how they saw Great Britain. Before the war, most colonists were proud British subjects. After the war, the relationship soured. The proclamation of 1763 felt like a betrayal. The new taxes, imposed by a distant parliament to pay a war debt, felt like an assault on their liberty. The presence of a standing army of redcoats on their soil in peacetime seemed less like protection and more like occupation. Britain, once the benevolent parent, now looked like a tyrant. This is the legacy of the French and Indian War, a frontier war that made America. It taught a generation the art of warfare, the necessity of unity, the value of self-reliance. It gave them a common enemy in the French. When that threat vanished, they found a new common opponent. The British government. The core idea that emerged, defense of one's own land, rights, and liberty, is the first and most essential duty. The colonists fought to protect their homes. In doing so, they took irreversible steps toward a new nation founded on self-rule.